Welcome to the State of Cyber War, a production of the Science, Secure, and Mind series of podcasts. Join us as we discuss international cybersecurity policy, information warfare, cyber defense, and how they affect the digital security of the world around us. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our latest episode in the Cybersecurity Advisors Network State of Cyber War podcast and video series. As always, I'm joined today by Hugo Tarrida in Madrid as another CYAN member, and this is continuing our series of conversations about cyber warfare capabilities, cyber attacks, threats, etc. in the Middle East. Today, we're going to be focusing on two of the usual suspects, specifically Iran and Israel. For those of you who've been paying attention to the news, both of these have been in the news quite frequently and in depth for a number of reasons. Iran even more so than previously. What we'd like to do is we're going to split up this originally planned for one episode conversation into two separate parts. That will give us a bit more flexibility to talk about first Israel and then Iran separately, because these are fairly involved topics. We're not going to talk about current events so much, because I think we'll leave that to the news sites and the information security analysis companies. But rather about some of the more structural elements, the organizations in both countries, and what they've actually been up to over the past couple of years. Hugo, if you want to quickly say hello and introduce yourself.
Yeah. So I think you already did most of it, but thanks for having me here. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk about Iran and Israel once again, and the whole issue in cyber being so big within the region itself, and the impacts as well.
Cool. All right, I'd say let's get cracking. I'll kick it off. As we agreed in our prep talk, I'll talk a little bit about Israel and their cyber defense and offense structures. I'll link to a website from the Council of Foreign Relations that actually gives a very, very cool overview of cyber warfare and cybersecurity capabilities for most of the world's countries. And I strongly recommend anybody who's watching this to visit that as well, to draw your own conclusions, essentially. I do also want to stress that while Hugo has a master's degree relevant to this, and we're both cybersecurity professionals, we are not the non plus ultra of experts. So we're approaching this from the perspective of reasonably well-informed professionals with some background, but draw your own conclusions. Does that sound about reasonable?
It does. Just so accurate enough.
All right. So Israel, I think most people in the cybersecurity world are going to be familiar with 8200. So Unit 8200, part of the Israeli Defense Force, is the major player in Israel. Is that about right? Say that's about,
yeah.
They're the big dogs.
Yeah.
Signals intelligence. They're subordinate to the Military Intelligence Directorate. They've got a wide range of activities. And for our friends in the United States, we're familiar with U.S. cyber security and cyber warfare capabilities. It's kind of an amalgamation of the National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA, and a bunch of other agencies' cyber warfare unit. Amman is the Military Intelligence Directorate that holds the governance, holds the reins of 8200, and they, of course, are the source of a huge amount of talent in the cybersecurity startup space as well. I'm part of an investment group, informal investment consortium, that looks at a lot of early stage startups, and there's some amazing products and services coming out of that world. I also, in doing some quick research, found something called Unit 8081, or the Secret Technology Unit, which sounds pretty cool. And as I understand it, this includes battlefield technology, possibly including cyber-related stuff. I would assume so. Have you ever heard of these guys?
I haven't, but I assume if it's battle technology, will include from literally weapons, physical weapons itself, to all aspects from satellites, communications, cyber, even like coding itself might even be part of it. Who knows? Like if it's probably secret, it's probably in development or in use without a lot of knowledge without outside their own sources.
I figured this one was probably more focused on things like securing battlefield communications, jamming, electronic countermeasures, that kind of thing. And I do realize that a lot of this is probably wrong, and I'm mainly browsing Wikipedia. So anybody who knows more, please put it in the comments. Uh, what I found really interesting was some of the training programs that I stumbled across, including, and I'm going to massacre my Hebrew here horribly, the Havatsalot program for training intelligence officers that includes a bachelor's university degree. And this seems to be general intelligence, not just cybersecurity, intel, and it's not just for 8200. And there's another thing called the Talpiot program. I don't know what those actually mean, for tech leadership. And again, not cyber offense, cyber defense specifically, but kind of general use of innovative technology. And again, I think all of this, given Israel's conscription system for its military, um, it because of this kind of integration of technology and innovation and leadership, it's another reason why there's so many startups coming out of there, the whole Israel startup country.
Yeah, another reason is, well, partly you mentioned the education level within Israel to train to create these not only then startups, but also the knowledge they give the people, the availability, resources. It's huge and massive compared to many countries. And that obviously allows them to get better professionals, perform better both in private sector, but also public, and then in case of warfare or hard damaging relations with other countries, they can also perform there very efficiently, very well. And obviously the results are being seen. They know that's why they keep investing in these
Mhm.
educational programs, both like at degree level, master degrees, and even further, because they give the reward. They are efficient. They are actually useful, and the evidence for it is there. Like people do learn a lot. People are then become very professionals and highly capable of doing many things.
It's good you mentioned that because I was actually going to touch on some of the interaction with Israeli universities. Two big ones I came across were Technion and Hebrew University. So there's a lot of cross pollination between government and military and the academic side of things. So you see quite a few of the high profile founders coming out of highly prestigious technical programs, going on to work in 8200 and other technology units. 8200 obviously more for cybersecurity, but there seems to be really a lot of overlap there. One other thing I came across on the structural and organizational side was the IDF, so the Israeli Defense Forces Information Security Department, which seems to be mainly defensive. So your traditional CISO kind of role. Um, there is also something I found called MAMRAM, the Center of Computing and Information Systems, central computing system, and that has some responsibility for cyber defense. I couldn't figure out what the difference was between the two. Then again, in my dealing with Israeli colleagues in the past, there has always been a degree of flexibility, which is, I think, one of the strengths of their cyber capabilities between different units. They're not locked into rigid silos. So I assume there's quite a bit of cross-pollination, overlap, and coordination between different groups, and also with the private sector, obviously.
Yeah, I will completely agree. Well, not only that, but what you mentioned before, the cross section within the army, the military sector itself, it's highly present and obviously gives huge results. And in countries like Israel, it's not only something people know is going to happen, for example, being in the army,
Mhm.
but people also perform and learn from it. So, for example, going to specific divisions in order to keep learning your own profession, learn more, even be capable, just have the also technology, the availability to perform different tasks, which you might not be able to otherwise.
And I'm glad you mentioned before that government interaction, the government support, because one thing that struck me, this is sounding like a marketing pitch for Israel Technology Hub. It's not intended, but I was very impressed by the export ministry runs some kind of an innovation hub where they really want big international blue chip companies, Fortune 500 companies, to go established presence there and actually coach their entrepreneurs because they realize that I don't think they get any initial immediate tangible benefit from that, but they realize that it's a two-way street. If you're an international company and you're an early adopter, you can help shape this technology and make it more attractive for you. At the same time, obviously, you're investing in non-tangible assets by sharing, with these kids essentially, what does the world look like? So that was I think this applies again, it's not just cybersecurity, but it applies across the entire technology space. Um,
Completely agree.
there's we broke down when we started researching this, we broke down the topics into roughly three bits, and this is the structures and organizations for both Israel and Iran, the cyber threats, cyber attacks and campaigns, and the disinformation side of things. So disinformation propaganda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of high profile attacks and threats and groups that both Israel government slash military and affiliated groups have executed, as well as sympathetic groups. And then we'll move more onto kind of a disinformation focus, which is obviously in today's geopolitical context a highly relevant and very charged topic if you've spent any time at all on any kind of social media, which I recommend against for your own, health and sanity. Um, and I think, I mean, the granddaddy of it all, we talked about this in our previous episode where we laid the groundwork of cyber stuff in the Middle East, was Stuxnet, obviously. If you were living under a rock in the 2000s, it was uncovered in 2010, attacked programmable logic controllers of a certain very specific type in an Iranian nuclear research facility, threw them off balance just enough to screw up. I think these nuclear centrifuges. I'm not a nuclear scientist. They do atomic bomb things, and had some very interesting features. Plus, is generally accepted to have been a collaboration between 8200 and the U.S. National Security Agency, or NSA, group called Tailored Access Operations, which I think is just one of the best evil sounding organization euphemism names I've ever come across. These are by the way, also some of the guys that were behind some of the campaigns that Edward Snowden, think of him what you will, uncovered and publicized when he did his whistleblowing campaign. Iran claims a follow-up Stuxnet 2.0 attack in 2018. I wasn't able to find a whole lot of information on that. Did you ever hear about that one?
I did see the claims, but as you said, there's no real proof, evidence, follow-up data to support it. However, I don't disregard it. I mean, I know cyber tends to be very under the radar. You might see an attack and only learn of it years after, which is something more that's happened with Stuxnet. Iran really noticed after the whole issue was done. So it might be plausible also within the time period of geopolitical events with the whole nuclear program restarting in Iran, then stopping and so on, the whole debate there. So it might have been possible. Obviously, no clue, no professional knowledge about that further than just knowing their claims about it.
I mean, it would make sense. I mean, Iran has a nuclear program, no matter, what the Trump administration did in terms of, or Obama before him, in terms of, getting it under control and then losing that control again. But it would make a lot of sense for the Israelis to want to continue to attack the electronic components of that. You made a very interesting comment last episode that a large percentage of Iran's cyber capability was essentially a reaction to Stuxnet, and come to Jesus moment. Well, maybe not Jesus per se, but
Yeah.
We need to do something.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Iran is a very big player within the region itself, even globally, some might say. But Iran was at least very behind in terms of cyber and technology, and partly because of the sanctions that they had, partly because it was fairly new. I mean, by early mid 2000s, 2010, cyber was fairly new. People were starting to actually develop things and even invest in it much in a much greater need. And obviously, countries like the US, which have that economic advantage, that technological advantage, were able to develop first. Then, obviously, Israel also, due to their own history, they have very strong military power, both physical and intangible, so cyber, which they also developed very, very quickly. But they obviously meant that they had the advantage regarding, for example, Stuxnet. They were able to come in, send the virus, disrupt the whole nuclear program, and leave per se without leaving much of a trace. And Iran only started developing because they suffered the attack itself. So they saw the vulnerability that they had, started developing, and they even made their own part regiment within the Revolutionary Guard, which is
Well,
specified
I'll
on
talk
cyber
about
technological.
in the next one. And
Yep.
I think what really now it really gets interesting, right? Because exactly because of what you mentioned, because now we get into the politics, right? So there's three particular piece of malware and campaigns that I want to mention. Those are Dooku, Flame, and Dooku 2.0. And this kind of goes back exactly to your point from just now, where you start getting into kind of a tit for tat back and forth. um, Dooku was a keylogger and info stealer that was uncovered in 2011. I'm not 100% sure about their targets, but Flame in 2012 was a similar kind of malware that targeted mostly Windows machines um, in various Middle Eastern countries, but mostly Iran. Um, Interestingly, they were more linked to the Equation group than to Israel per se, by Kaspersky. And this is where it gets really fun, right? Um, Equation group, if you'll recall, is tied to whom we just mentioned, the NSA's tailored access operations. Israel, NSA, I don't know, right? So maybe somebody knows in the comments, but because here it gets really fun. Dooku 2.0, similar information stealer keylogger, was uncovered in 2015 in hotels in Switzerland and Austria. Um, and it was designed to steal information from participants participating in the then ongoing nuclear negotiations. Dooku 2.0 allowed the Israelis to, let me check my notes here. Um, dup, 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 to basically claim that Kaspersky software, antivirus software, was either through a backdoor or intentionally being used to steal information itself from participants. So here we go. The New York Times alleges this breaches of Kaspersky in 2014 is what allowed Israel to notify the use of Russian hackers using Kaspersky software to retrieve sensitive data. Now, the relationship between the US government, Kaspersky, Russian state affiliate actors is an interesting topic all on its own that I don't even pretend to have an initial a good overview of. But these kind of this quadruple play of Israel, US, Iran, Russia, plus a couple of wild cards from the private sector involved in there it shows the sheer complexity of this. What is also really interesting is the Flame malware was in my mind an escalation of um, the Stuxnet active targeting, because it was also used to disconnect Iranian oil terminals from the internet, right? So whether that was the Equation group or tailored access operations or the Israelis, obviously there's some highly complementary objectives between the two. Um, I find it interesting that there is at on the one hand this kind of broader Middle Eastern scope for all of these, on the other hand specific Iranian focusing.
I mean, I completely agree, but obviously, what I find more or less funny is how Israel and Iran both call the big brother, right, which would be the US and Russia, in order to help them, whether it's
I
some
think
development.
I think they use nastier terms than Big Brother. Great Satan has come up.
But like just to help both develop, implement, and activate both like different virus, malware, spyware, and so on. Which obviously it has to be effective because they keep doing it. For example, you mentioned how Dooku was in order to retrieve the information. I didn't know. I don't know if you knew, but Israel now has spyware which is called Pegasus,
Yeah, I was just
which
about
they
to get,
more or
I was about
less
to get, I was about to get to Pegasus.
now, yeah, which they more or less they use, which is seems a better upgrade of what you were just saying of Dooku, just an upgrade. How this evolution obviously is just more or less trial and error. You throw it, does it work? Where are the improvements? Let's create a new one, and so on. So obviously the improvement is there, but also the financing behind it, how technology keeps moving, how the money keeps being invested to keep
Yeah.
improving it itself.
And the information on Flame comes primarily from Kaspersky. So again, there's this really there seems to be a little bit of shade being thrown behind the scenes between all parties. Um, there's some quotes I found around about Dooku 2.0. The Guardian has it quote unquote linked to Israel. The Council of Foreign Relations has quote unquote suspected state sponsor Israel, which also appears to come from the Guardian article, but they don't attribute it. Right. You mentioned Pegasus. That's a great segue because these are the two additional kind of families I quickly want to mention. The NSO Group is an Israeli company. They're still in operation, and Pegasus was a very high profile spyware that was used that popped up in a whole bunch of places a few years ago. So if you look for Pegasus malware, or spyware, you'll find a number of news articles on this. Um, Interestingly enough, both the Pegasus and Chrysaor, I don't know how do you pronounce it. It's another NSO program. Have been widely used by Arab governments and others against dissidents at the same time as the Israeli police, in some cases, unlawfully used them. But I couldn't find any instances of use of against adversaries of Israel per se. Right. That's not to say it didn't get used that way, but it's really interesting that the NSA group, despite being as heavily linked, affiliated, friendly, obviously, as an Israeli cybersecurity startup to the Israeli government, as you would expect any Israeli cybersecurity technology company to be, the interplay between being allied with Israel's national interests and basically selling to Arab governments as well. I
Yeah,
urge people to draw their own conclusions about the geopolitical impacts of, for example, the Saudis using Israeli, developed spyware to spy on their own dissidents.
I mean, just to give a bit of clarification, a few years ago, Morocco used the Pegasus against Spain itself, and it was
Yeah.
like the Spanish security developed, figured out it was Pegasus, and then figured out it was coming from Morocco instead of Israel, which obviously goes back to the point you're saying. Israel is selling this. Well, Israel, like the company itself, selling the spyware to other countries, whether they might be more aligned or less aligned to Israel. Obviously, private company money is money, but once again, they have to be. I highly believe they are linked to the government itself. So would they need the approval beforehand?
There's gonna be some links at some point, and whether those links are formal or informal, we'll get into that more in the disinformation side of things, I suspect. And of course, anybody who's not familiar with this, the history of Spanish Moroccan relationships has a long and storied um, body of reading that I encourage anybody to look into. I mean, if you go back to the 1920s, I think you might be doing pretty well. It's also raised interesting points in Western governments about assigning responsibility for the usage of spyware and malware. I remember that case, and Spain and Israel have not always had the warmest of relationships. In case you've been following the news recently, they
Yeah,
blocked a ship carrying arms for Israel to dock in I forget which Spanish harbor it was, but it has really interesting implications for example, the European Union assignation of responsibility if you are selling malware that's used by an adversarial government against your own government. And obviously, one of the Snowden revelations was that the US was using all kinds of hacking tools, for example, in Angela Merkel's phone. You know, who is responsible ultimately for that? I'm not a legal expert, but it is a consideration. Uh,
Yeah, the fact that let me jump in.
yeah,
The fact
please.
that they are already attributing fault and blame to someone is already a big issue because within cyber, as most people know, there are no borders itself. So someone can attack you being in a different country, but being a national of a third country itself. So it's very vague. And the fact that you can start blaming people or countries itself is a big step because then what are you going to do as a consequence, whether it's political, whether it's like at a geopolitical level? How is that going to then navigate? How is that going to change? That aspect is starting to change. And I think it has already started. And the geopolitical shift is also being seen, which then goes back to, does that mean more cyber attacks? Does that mean more hacking, more spying? Or is it going to be a cool off and say, okay, let's just stop, rest a bit, and then see what happens?
Another great segue to the last one I want to mention, that's predatory sparrow. And this is an Israeli linked, quote unquote, according to foreign policy campaign that, for example, in 2022, it caused physical damage to at least one Iranian steel mill. There's been attacks on a number of physical plants, including various areas of CNI, critical national infrastructure like gas stations. Um, and in relation to this, I found in this foreign policy article, well, I'll link all these in the description, a quote from Charles Freilich, who's Israel's former deputy national security advisor. "Quote unquote, cyber is less escalatory than kinetic. And so they can do it with an expectation of a lesser response from the other side." You had a really good point, which is that now we're starting to see more attribution very, very openly, right? At the same time as, if you buy into this guy's quote that this is lets you damage your opponent, including physically, in a way that's, maybe as damaging, but less obnoxious than dropping bombs on them.
Yeah, completely agree. And also the fact that obviously cyber tends to have a cyber response. So a cyber attack tends to have a no cyber response. So it's very unlikely that you get hacked and you're going to go and bomb on the other country.
Hmm.
It's highly, highly unlikely. I haven't seen any case that, to be honest, unless that they are already in war in high conflict. But the fact that now it's being more open means that retaliatory attack, whether it's in cyber, can be more damaging. So it can be scaled up.
Mhm.
Instead of, oh, you hacked me and stole, let's say, X amount of information. Well, I'm going to do the same. No, this time I'm going to drop your whole network for a week and see what happens. Because don't do it again. If not, it's going to go worse. The scaling up of attacks is happening, and I do strict believe it myself. However, they are still contained within the cyber realm, which is
Even less than
fairly to say.
damage.
Fairly to say, I think it's still better to keep it contained in cyber realm, but obviously there's escalating. That's never good.
And this is, I mean, this in the Iran portion, in the next episode, we'll get into. I want to talk quickly about the National Information Network and precisely this kind of how do I defend against that kind of escalatory, type of offensive activity that can cause physical damage, right? I think now, though, hand it over to you. Let's talk about disinformation. Obviously, it's a
So, yeah.
big deal right now. What do you think?
So yeah, disinformation, obviously, and information itself, propaganda, highly valuable, highly, highly powerful. So top Israeli officials have said several times that both information, propaganda, disinformation itself are very powerful, very, very important tools to both manage and implement, but also control the whole sphere of it. Obviously, with disinformation, you can lie about things, distort the reality. And for example, it is true that in my case, I couldn't find that much regarding Israeli disinformation campaigns. I did find of information campaigns and propaganda, but not so much in disinformation. However, I did find that there was an Israeli group which officially was not linked to the government, but obviously I have my doubts that they were able to hack and manipulate over 30 national elections of countries, different countries worldwide. This was obviously done to make the government more pro-Israeli, like Israeli views. They use different methods. For example, very common one is through Facebook. They created huge amounts of fake accounts just to spread the same fake news.
But
That
this
way, it
was
had
this
like
was this was this an IDF organization? Was this a
it
Mossad thing?
was a private company itself, so it wasn't Israeli government, but I do believe it was Israeli government linked because obviously they had to have finance from somewhere, and obviously the targets and so on had to be more specific rather than general. My opinion, I couldn't find further information regarding that. Obviously, one of the methods, and I was like Twitter, for example, very common. But instead of using bots, which is something like Russia does a lot, they created the accounts itself. So they created thousands and thousands of accounts, which seemed legit, just to spread the disinformation, which then saw a larger audience and so on, which obviously then had a huge impact regarding who to vote, your choices, your views on different topics. Another issue would be, for example, propaganda itself. Israeli has huge propaganda campaigns all over news and social media. For example, Twitter, even in TikTok, they have a lot of propaganda, which obviously is all to make Israel seem better, um, the good guys per se. And I do believe it works. I mean, you see them and you think, oh, it's actually, Israeli military is very well equipped. They're very good training and military force to be respected and so on. But then you think about it and it's like, is this the truth? Is it just propaganda? Is it me just selling the idea, well, buying the idea of it? It's a
And
bit of the play they want to do.
that's a huge issue, especially in a highly emotionally charged atmosphere. I mean, Israel and Middle East is always going to be something that brings out, the trolls and the disinformation, but especially, since the Gaza thing kicked off last year. I mean, there was a Haaretz in 2021. They uncovered and again, Israeli paper, right? Yay, free press, an IDF campaign to manipulate social media in relation to the then, the 11-day war with Hamas back in 21. And there was, I remember on Reddit and a few other sites, there was something, the photos of the and videos actually of IDF soldiers at their PCs, spreading information, misinformation, disinformation,
Yeah, a bit of everything.
manipulation.
Mm.
It goes so far as already back in 2019 there was accusations of Israeli involvement in, for example, pushing for Eurovision boycotts. And with, if any of our non-European friends who haven't followed Eurovision, I strongly encourage you to. This year's was hilarious. Um, but there was a lot of noise about manipulation of votes or influencing by government affiliated groups, and obviously there was a lot of protests related to Gaza and the Israeli participation in Eurovision. So it's all over the place.
Yeah. Another thing that Israel does, which is I found completely amazing because it's something I really did not think in depth about it, to be honest, is they have huge amounts of contact with journalists, newspapers itself at a global scale. So they have apparently huge contacts and direct contact with journalists in top newspapers. So CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, in order to give first-hand news about things, which obviously means that they can distort reality a bit, but also encourage pro-Israeli views within their newspaper because they obviously have contact with not only journalists itself, but like high-ranking people within those organizations. Something that obviously does influence because then you read those newspapers, you read those articles, and you're getting those views from whether it's bias, which is well not bias, sorry, which is neutral, which it should be, or if it's bias, which might be after reading this, you don't really know. So it's very interesting how they can manipulate. They have different methods of. However, they do tend to be more underground, more undercover than other countries. For example, Iran, as we will talk later. It's much more obvious and much more well known what they do than, for example, Israel, which tends to try to hide it a bit.
It's interesting you mentioned the rest because if you look, Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post are, two of the biggest Israeli domestic newspapers, and they're among the biggest, excuse me, but shit stirrers in Israel and the biggest, investigate. I mean, I can't imagine that Netanyahu likes, most of the Haaretz journalistic corps because, so one question for you. I mean, when you say they can manipulate, so my totally anecdotal experience, I have a lot of Israeli friends and colleagues, and I get the sense that obviously the people that I deal with, they tend to be international, educated, yeah, my guys, um, and I think fairly liberal minded, but I sense a desire to want to argue in good faith, and I'm terrible at judging people. I'm terrible at judging human beings, right? So maybe they're pulling a fast one on me, but is it necessarily manipulation, or is it simply using channels to get just their version of the story out, whether that's right or wrong?
Oh, I do agree that it's probably just getting the story out, just directly contacting the journalist, for example, in order to get the story straight as it is. However, just the doubt, for example, in my case, just the doubt of knowing that it might be manipulated, your trust is already not going to be 100%. You might say, "Oh, I've just read this piece of news. Let me check it with another one if I have time. Let me see." Already, that piece of doubt is already an issue because, in theory, newspaper should be trusted itself. Whole organization is based on we tell the news how it is, we tell the truth, we don't lie about it. But obviously, that doubt already makes and has a lot of implication itself. So I do believe in most cases they're just sending their message out and letting people know.
But just
In
the
other
fact that
cases,
the fact that we know that there are IDF social media manipulation campaigns, yeah, it's a good point. And again, what's even worse is that the fact that, quote unquote, are, whether it's BBC or El País or New York Times, are not always as factual and totally impartial as they could or should be, really plays into the hands of people who cast doubt on their impartiality. Whether you're pro-Palestinian, whether you're right wing, whether you're pro-Israeli, it doesn't really matter. So it's a good point.
yeah, just that small piece of doubt. And obviously, the newspapers are run by people and people get it wrong. That's completely fine and understandable. However, if you get something wrong, which is it keeps getting contrasted and keeps being wrong, and other newspapers discredit what you're saying, that trust starts to decline, and obviously it becomes to be a less and less reliable piece of newspaper. But on top of that, just knowing, for example, in Spain, that they are clearly marked per se left and right wing newspapers. So depending on what you read, they're gonna be like, "Oh yeah, Israel is doing a great job," or "Yeah, Israel is not doing such a good job. They should do better." Already that difference
Yeah.
shows that there is some manipulation, where it's just political views rather than the information itself, because the content might be the same. But that small difference can have a very large impact because the audience it has is going to be very, very different. And in
Especially
my case,
given that the trust in quote unquote mainstream traditional media has never been lower in most of the West, which is really unfortunate. Um,
yeah.
that's a
And
good sorry.
what I'm going to add, like most people now, my generation, we don't read that much newspapers. We tend to see more social media. So if you mix both, so social media manipulation and maybe distrust towards traditional newspaper, already sets the way to what are you going to trust more? Something you see in social media, which might be much more manipulated than in the newspaper. That issue, that trust, obviously, many countries play with it. For example, Israel is one of them.
Mhm.
Iran, Spain, the US, they all do it. However, that doubt is already there. It's already set in.
I think that one thing I quickly want to mention before we have to wrap up is one big deal for me is also the fact that Israel has such a large international diaspora. And the point that you made, I think, is crucial, that social media it is a main source of quote unquote news, TikTok or Insta or whatever, for especially younger people, even though, traditionally a lot of older people tend to be easily manipulated on Facebook and things like that. Some stereotypes here. But the fact that Israel has such a large diaspora, and the fact that social media lends itself to interaction, by average citizens, and that diaspora is obviously going to have very often an interest in telling their side of the story, right or wrong. We're not judging. Um, Makes it likely that you're going to get some kind of bias in these forums, whether it's intentional or not. Because we're cheapskates and we're on the free Zoom, we're running out of time. Join us soon for the next installment where we're going to be talking about Iran. So everything's going to be linked in the comments. and I'll see you next time.
See you.
Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.